Hello, cruel, cruel world. My name is Dr. Shahan Das. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist. I assess mentally disordered offenders for a living so that you do not have to. Okay, so I saw this interesting clip. It was Jimmy Carr talking to Mike Birbiglia, did I get that right? About suicide. So firstly, Jimmy Carr talks about how his comedy saved a fan that was on the brink of this. And then he talks about his interpretation of suicide in general. And he kind of makes the point that he believes that comedy can prevent it. And I immediately thought, I need to make a YouTube video for all y'all, because I think this is a fascinating subject. So even though currently I specialize in assessing offenders, suicide and suicide prevention is a bread and butter task of a psychiatrist. So I've done suicide risk assessments many, many times. And also, a sad truth is it's a part of a psychiatrist's career. So I've literally dealt with people who are suicidal. I've seen dead bodies on a ward after somebody's hung themselves. I've even broken news to a husband of a wife that has committed suicide. So I guess I've been in the thick of it. So this is why it interests me and why I think I can talk about it. So in this episode, I'm going to analyze what Jimmy Carr said. I'm going to see if it fits in with my kind of clinical knowledge, my clinical practice. I'm going to tell you about suicide prevention in general. So I'm going to explain all the scientific factors. I'm going to impress you with some psychiatric jargon to make myself sound more clever than I actually am. And I'm going to tell you some statistics about suicide in general. I'm also going to tell you my overall impressions of Jimmy Carr as a comedian, as a person, as well as what he said. My intention for making these videos is to educate you, all y'all, my Psych for Sore guys and gals, so you can start thinking like a forensic psychiatrist. Also to take over the world. That's not going so great. Okay, so I'm going to whet your appetite by first of all showing you this clip about Jimmy Carr discussing about how his comedy might have saved somebody on the brink of suicide. So let's get into it.
I hadn't seen it pre-show, and this woman said, I'm celebrating my 15 bonus years tonight because of you. Thank you. And I didn't know what that meant. And so I get chatting to the girl in the audience. I said, "It's bonus years." And she said, I'm a depressive, and I was going to kill myself when I was 15. And I was waiting till everyone went to sleep in the house, and I was going to hang myself. And I had nothing to do while I was waiting. So I was looking at YouTube, and I found a clip of you, and I laughed. And then I watched more, and I kept laughing. And I'm alive now.
Oh my gosh.
And it was like, I didn't know what to do.
Wow.
I didn't know what to do with it. And you kind of go, that weird thing that we do just for fun, just to make people laugh. And you go, well, sometimes some people really need it.
Yeah.
You know, on occasion, there's that thing where you go, because what is suicide? It's the...
Okay, I'm going to come back to Jimmy's comments on suicide, but let's just discuss what he said. So, firstly, suicide is the biggest killer of men under 45 in the UK. It's also the biggest killer of women between 45 and 54 in the UK. So it's a major public health issue is what I'm trying to say. So, aside for sore guys, I have a question for you. Bit of a morbid question. But it's this: how many suicides do you think occur in the UK per year? And also, what's the rate of suicide? So what's like 1 in 50, 100, 1,000 people commit suicide per person per year? Answers later on in this episode. All right, I'm going to play you a bit more about what Jimmy Carr thinks about the gift of laughter related to suicide, and then I'm going to break down the factors that protect you against suicide. Let's go.
permanent solution to a temporary problem. It's no perspective. And what do jokes offer? Well, it's perspective.
Yeah.
That's what it's about. It's like pulling back from this embarrassing, terrible situation.
Yeah.
You're jumping out a window and you're going to kill yourself because you've got a sleep disorder. But somehow you manage to get the focus wide enough, and it's a brilliantly funny, uplifting story.
Yeah.
But it's a terrible thing happened.
Yeah.
And having that, it's a really kind of, it's not particularly about, it happened to be my stuff, but it could have been anyone's stuff.
Right.
It was just this gift of laughter and the idea that you could...
Okay, so I'm going to get into the meat and bones of what my comments and this episode is about, which is the factors that can significantly decrease the risk of suicide. So I would split them into 3 separate categories. I'm going to tell you about them now, and then we'll see how Jimmy Carr's comments fit into all of that. So the categories are strengthening individual resilience, building supportive environments, and addressing the underlying risks. So let's take them one at a time. So category number 1 for preventing suicide is strengthening individual resilience. So how do you do this? What does that actually mean, doctor? Stop using all these jargonistic terms to try and sound clever. Actually tell me what you mean. So I'm talking about building healthy coping mechanisms. So you teach individuals ways to manage their stress, to manage their emotions, and just to manage like the challenges of everyday life. And you give them tools so that they know how to navigate through difficult situations without wanting to self-harm, without considering suicide. And sometimes these can be relatively simple. Sometimes all the individual needs is some sort of routine or some sort of purpose. So I'll give you a quick example. I saw a woman in clinic when many years ago when I was a junior doctor. She was in her 50s. She had severe depression. She was just really struggling, man. She was isolated. She was withdrawn. She lacked energy. She had teenage children but was really barely engaging with them. She tried numerous different antidepressants and they helped to a degree, but unfortunately because of the side effects she couldn't really continue taking them. So I saw her many times and eventually I suggested some simple behavioural changes. So for example, she used to sort of sit around in the mornings, not get out of bed. Her poor kids had to kind of basically fend for themselves. Their kids would go off to school by themselves. This woman would get up sort of around midday, would mope around the house feeling really low. She would go to the newsagents around the corner. She would buy like 5 chocolate bars. She would binge on them for like the pleasure and the sugar rush. And then as you would expect, she would come crashing down later on and she would feel worse. So together we came up with this structural plan, which is that she would actually accompany her kids to school, walk with them, walk around the park near their school for half an hour, and kind of as a treat, as a sense of accomplishment for doing that, she would have 1 chocolate bar and come back home. Now, I know that probably sounds like really simplistic, but it actually really helped her because it just got her out of this rut. It got her into a routine. It gave her a purpose. And if I'm being selfish, from my perspective as a junior doctor, it really helped me because it taught me something, which is that sometimes the answer isn't medication. Sometimes it's something as simple as basic lifestyle choices. Okay, so moving on. In this category of how to prevent suicide, which is strengthening individual resilience, there's also fostering social connection. So having strong and supportive relationships with family would be one thing, friends, mentors, just basically to give the individual a sense of belonging and understanding and purpose, which in itself can be a protective factor against isolation, against despair, and therefore can lead you to be protective against suicide itself. And I think that works in 2 separate kind of mechanisms. One is just basically related to having a support circle. So when you're low, you know that you can depend on a friend, because let's face it, no one told you that life is going to be this way. Your job's a joke, yeah? You're broke. Your love life's what? Dead on arrival, DOA. And it's like you're always stuck in second gear. And, you know, sometimes it hasn't been your week, your day, your month, even your year, you know? So fostering social connections can strengthen your sense of identity because let's face it, no man is an island. Apart from maybe the Isle of Man, but that's confusing matters. So it makes you feel connected. It gives you a sense of purpose. And then finally, within this category, I would say promoting self-worth and meaning. So you're helping individuals cultivate this positive sense of self, recognize their strengths, recognize their capabilities. Basically, you're helping them discover a purpose. Okay, moving on. Category number 2 for preventing suicide is building a supportive environment. So there's lots of ways you can do this. One of them could be actually accessing or reducing the access to death. So reducing exposure to firearms, reducing certain medications. That can actually decrease, well, let's think about this logically. It doesn't stop somebody being depressed, it doesn't stop somebody contemplating suicide, but it can decrease the number of impulsive acts during moments of crisis. So I'll give you a specific example. As you may or may not know, anaesthetists are at a higher risk of suicide than the general public and than other doctors. And obviously there's lots of factors, including the fact that they work in very high stress jobs and they have to deal with like cardiac arrest. But access to lethal means of medications is also one of those factors. Also within this category would be creating a safe space. So providing access to mental health resources in schools and in workplaces and in communities. So basically creating a safe haven. And I have to say, sadly, as a psychiatrist, I think that this is generally woefully inadequate. But I do think it is very gradually increasing and improving. I think that kids, adolescents, for example, can talk about their mental illness now with less judgment. So I'll give you an example. I'm 45 years old, right? So I was a teenager about 300 years ago. And back then, talking about mental health or admitting that you had a mental health problem, you'd have been severely judged. I'm not saying there isn't any stigma now, there is, but I think it's a lot more, people are a lot more open and accepting to even have those conversations in the first place, which obviously is a good thing. I'd like to see it get better and speed up. Also related to this category would be combating stigma and discrimination. So that's kind of connected to what I just said, addressing societal stigma surrounding mental health and suicide. Because if you do that, then you can encourage individuals who need help to actually go and get help, see their GP, see a therapist, start medication if they need it. And it reduces, it makes them get help sooner, and it reduces these feelings of shame or isolation because you've got a mental health problem. So obviously this is a huge and slow process to reduce stigma, but I do think actually, some positive news for once coming from me, as I do think it's one of the areas that's gradually improving in life, because I think partially at least because celebrities are coming out and talking about them, and we follow celebrities, don't we? So if celebrities are brave enough to talk about their mental health issues, then it means that we feel that we're represented, we being people with mental health issues. By the way, I've got a question for you, Psych guys and gals. Are there any celebrities or personalities that you find particularly inspiring because they talk about their mental health issues? I've got to say, I'm a new convert to this guy, Ren. So I actually did a video reacting to the music video, Hi Ren. I think he's a very talented individual. He's a very good rapper. He's got a very clever and talented way of incorporating his own experience into his music. Talks about mental illness. His fans are judgmental. Woo, boy, you should see the number of negative comments and threats that I got when I did my honest reaction to his video. It wasn't even that negative, but anyway. I will leave the link in the description, so go check out that video. But let me know about your celebrities who you feel the same way, who've inspired you because they talk about mental health issues. Moving on, category number 3, to decrease mental health issues and reduce the risk of suicide is pretty basic. It's addressing the underlying issues. So if you've got a mental health condition, if you've got depression, anxiety, if there's unresolved trauma, addressing all of this through therapy, for example, can significantly reduce suicidal thoughts and behaviors. And also substance abuse. So of all the suicide risk assessments that I've done, and I've done a lot, alcohol use is huge. I'd say well over half of the people that I see are either have an addiction problem or they act more suicidal when they're disinhibited because they've been drinking. So you address that, you reduce the risk. Okay, let's get back to Jimmy Carr, and then I'll tell you some more thoughts about some more things.
You don't know as well where it ends up. Who's watching your special now and feeling like, oh, maybe I'm not so crazy.
I feel like that's the difference between when I was younger doing comedy and now doing comedy, is I think in my impulse when I started in my 20s was I want to be famous, I want to be successful, I want to make people laugh because it's this thing I do and whatever. And at a certain point, I think it does change over to the thing you're describing, which is, oh, actually, sometimes this has an effect on people's lives. And if you can do that, that's quite significant.
Just as a general comment, I kind of touched on this before when I was talking about celebrities. I think it's really good that people are talking about mental health so openly, suicidality. I think it's a shift. Like for your younger viewers, you might not realize this, but these topics were considered taboo even as recently as 10 years ago, I'd say. All right, moving on. I want to tell you what I think of Jimmy Carr, my overall impression of him, and then about what he said about suicide and how it all fits together. So I'm going to merge what he said versus what I said, and let's see if there is an overlap. So I have to admit, I've never been a huge fan of Jimmy Carr's comedy. I think, obviously, he's extremely popular, and at one point it seemed that he was almost hosting every single panel show or game show on TV in the UK. He's both ubiquitous and he's omnipotent. Go and get a dictionary, you bums. But for me, I just think his jokes are a bit too crass, and I think they're a bit too predictable. So obviously comedy is subjective, and he is hugely successful, and I know lots of people that like him, so he must be talented. I'm not saying he's not talented, but my opinion, my problem with his comedy is that I personally think that a good comedian should be wittier than the audience. They should be able to outsmart the audience. They should be able to have a setup going in one direction and then suddenly kind of blindside the audience with a funny punchline that completely throws off where they were going. So a good comedian throws the audience off the scent. And honestly, with Jimmy Carr, I genuinely think that I can predict half to 3/4 of his punchlines. I honestly think that I can do that much. And I think probably most people can. So I suppose I don't really see the skill. If I know what you're going to say, then where's the comedic skill in outsmarting me comedically? That's what I think. Anyway, I want to make the point that I don't think being rude or controversial in itself is bad, and I don't think that makes you a bad comedian, in my opinion. So off the top of my head, Jim Jeffries, Doug Stanhope are two very good comedians that are very rude. But I think you have to be rude and funny. And I think that some comedians conflate the two. So the audience ends up being shocked rather than being amused. And they laugh, I think, out of awkwardness and embarrassment rather than because what the comedian has said is particularly funny. Jimmy Carr, I feel like that way about him. Also, Anthony Jeselnik, is that his name? I think that way about him as well. So I've got another question for you, my Psych for Soul guys and gals. What do you think of Jimmy Carr? Like, what do you think about his comic ability? As I said, I know loads of people that like him, so I actually think I'm probably in the minority in my view. And also, on a separate note, what do you think? Can you tell me of any successful comedians that are successful but you personally don't rate? And you kind of wonder, how the hell did they get there? Who do they sleep to get to the top? Let me know in the Schmormich section below. Having said all of that, having thrown shade at Jimmy Carr, no offense, Jimmy, I have to say, to my surprise, in this particular podcast, and I've seen him on a couple of others, I thought he came across as very intelligent, very thoughtful, and very insightful. And I've also read his autobiography quite recently called Before and Laughter. And he just has a high level of emotional intelligence and insight. And when you get to hear him in his book and in these podcasts, and you hear his like internal perspectives, he's just so much more relatable as a person. Because I think his persona on stage is actually quite robotic and quite callous. And I get it. I get that he makes this character because it's funnier. So I understand that. But I'm just saying that I was pleasantly surprised. I've seen another side of him through the book and through the podcast. Okay, so stop beating around the bush. What do I think about what Jimmy Carr actually said about suicide, and how does that match up with my experience? Before I get into that, let me introduce you to this channel. It is called A Schmike for Small Minds. I dissect a whole plethora of videos related to mental illness or related to offending and the crossover betwixt the two. I've done videos on as broad as whether you should have children. I've done videos specifically about Dr. Dre and depression, Busta Rhymes and PTSD and grief. Go and check it out. I implore you to subscribe. Not only does it help me out immensely, but it actually means that you, yes, you will be served at the bar quicker for the rest of your life. You won't have to wait around when people who've got there after you get served before you. I know that pisses you off, and I don't blame you. Guaranteed all your money back. Okay, back to the episode. What Jimmy Carr said about suicide. So my interpretation of what he said is that there are some people that look through life with a depressive kind of lens. And I would say that's very common. So one of the symptoms of depression is negative cognitions. So things like general pessimism, including for the future, self-hatred, lower self-esteem. That's how people kind of think. That's how they see everything. So I think what Jimmy Carr is saying is that comedy can remind them that there is, levity, there is happiness, there is laughter, there is humor, and it can kind of, hopefully, in theory, get them out of this funk. I suppose when I was watching the video, I was struggling to see how, listening to comedy clips, prevention of suicide, how that all kind of gets together with what I was saying in theory. I suppose the closest thing that I can think of is that it's connected to building healthy coping mechanisms. And I must admit that I've treated hundreds of patients who've been depressed. I've treated hundreds that have self-harmed. I can only think off the top of my head of maybe one that actually would watch comedy as a coping mechanism. And I think that's a shame. I actually think it's an untapped resource. Usually it's something else. Usually it's listening to music or human connection or speaking to a friend or exercise or something like that. And I just think it's a shame because I think comedy could potentially be a really good kind of source to help combat mental health issues. I won't be crass enough to say that it's going to cure your depression. I don't think that. But I think if you're having a bad day, it can be one thing that can kind of help you get over the edge, I think. I suppose the other thing I was thinking about, I don't think Jimmy Carr was talking about this specifically, but it's connected, is actually physically going to gigs. Would that help? So when I was talking about my categories of suicide prevention, I suppose that connects to fostering social connections. So if you have good relationships, go to comedy gigs with your family, with your friends, that can help combat isolation and despair. The one thing I would say quite strongly is that you have to pick the right gigs. And I'll be honest with you, I go to comedy quite a lot, and there are a lot of very poor quality comedy gigs. They're usually the cheap ones. They're usually the ones downstairs in pubs or upstairs. It's sometimes free. And it's basically because there are hundreds of open micers. I'm talking about my experience of living in London. And a lot of them are very poor quality. I don't mean to be cruel, but that's the truth. That's my experience. I've seen several hundred of them. Some of them are good, but not that many. In fact, there's a saying that in London, you're never more than 200 meters away from a wannabe comic. Or was that a rat? I'm not sure. Anyway, I should know about being an open mic comic because I actually was one myself. I've practiced the art of comedy. I've done about 40 gigs in recent years and about 40 gigs in my early 20s. So was I low quality? Was I good? Did I have the gift of gab of stand up? That's for you to decide. Because I'm going to give you a link to me doing some stand-up, another YouTube video. I'll put the link in the Schwammenschmection in the description, but I'll also put a thumbnail at the end. Can Dr. Grande do that? Does he offer you that? Okay. Before we finish, let's kill this sense of levity by going to the following issue. I asked you at the beginning how many people in the UK commit suicide and what's the suicide rate. The answer is, in 2020, there were 6,500 people that took their lives in the UK. So that equates to roughly 1 in every 800 people that will die by suicide every year in the UK. That's pretty shocking, isn't it? That's quite tragic. It's quite high. But anyway, moving on. Are there any other videos? In fact, if there are any other videos you want me to react to, any celebrities, etc., let me know in the section below. I've got loads of videos that I think might be of interest to you. Just search on my channel. I put the links for some of them. Is suicide selfish? Jada Pinkett Smith talking about suicide risk. The video of me doing comedy. The video of me reacting to High Ren. Go chickadee chickadee. Check all of that out. Until next time, have a blessed day. Peace. And do not forget, I love you.